Welcome to this webinar. The purpose is to give a demonstration of some of the clinFHIR modules that I've mentioned in the most recent blog post on clinFHIR that you can see at fireblog.com. If you go there, you'll see this blog, which is at the moment it's at the top. If I click on that to view it, then we will see that I've described a number of modules down here, and I've given screenshots of some, but it's very brief. So the purpose is to take a look in a little bit more depth on some of the modules. We are going to start by going to the clinFHIR launch site, which is this URL here called clinFHIR.com, and from here we can launch most of the clinFHIR modules. The first thing I'll point out, as was mentioned in that blog post, is that many of the modules will actually look to servers which are configured here to decide which server they're going to look at. In most cases you want to set these to something like the public FHIR library. In fact, we can do that just by setting that to the default. We're going to make a start by looking at the patient viewer. The patient viewer is designed to be able to display data about a patient that's stored on a FHIR server and is available through the FHIR RESTful API. It is launched from the main clinFHIR launcher app from clinFHIR.com, and it's the first option on that menu. Before you launch it, make sure to set the data server over in this current servers tab to the one that you want, because that is the server that the patient viewer will access. So we'll start the module like so. The first thing you need to do is to select the patient whose data you wish to view. You do that by clicking the Select Patient button like so. You have two options. The first option is to select an existing patient which is on that server, and you can do that using the patient name, the ID of the patient if you know it, or an identifier. The alternative is to add a new patient with a set of consistent known data. Let's take that approach. Click the Add New Patient link. You'll notice that the name defaults to a random name. It uses an internet web service for that. The date of birth defaults to today. We can change that if we wish to by going back in time like so. We can set the gender, and most importantly, ensure that the Generate Samples checkbox remains checked. Now click the Add Patient. What happens now is that the patient is saved to the server, and then the predefined test resources are also saved, and you can see now that the process has completed. Click Close, and the display will now show those created resources. Because they've been created on the server, if you close the tab down and go back into it again, you can search for this patient and you will find these resources. So there are a number of tabs to this application. The Resource Explorer displays the resources, and this is the one we will focus on. Resource References Graphs shows all of the resource instances for a patient. Numeric Observations and Vitals displays a number of graphs from the observations which are numeric in nature, and the Encounter Timeline is just another display which shows the resources by encounter. So these are the encounters here on a timeline. If we click one, we see that the details are shown down here along with the JSON, and we can go in and we can look at the references like so. We're going to spend most of our time on the Resource Explorer. A key concept in FHIR is obviously that of the resource. It's the R in resource. But you can think of resource in two ways. The first is the type, which is the kind of resource that it is. So this is sort of like if you were thinking of a cookie cutter, this would be a cookie. This would be the cutter, and the cutter is then used to make out cookies, which are resource instances. So what we see here is we see the different resource types that exist for this patient on this server: the allergy resource type, the appointment type, the condition type, and so forth. And then for each of those types we see the particular instances which have been created. So if I click on this link, on this entry here for condition, which has 11 instances, we will see the individual condition instances shown down here, and I can select any one of them and see the details. For each selected resource instance, there are a number of different views. The first one is this tree view, and this is really representing all of the elements in the resource as if it were a hierarchical tree. The text shows the resource.txt element. The JSON shows the actual JSON representation of this resource instance if it were being shared, and we can look at that both as JSON and as XML. The two representations are exactly the same, and it's possible to convert between the two of them. So the only reason why you'd choose one over the other is because of personal preference. These days the JSON representation is gaining prominence, mostly because it's native to web browsers and JavaScript applications. This tab over here is interesting. What it shows is the references between resource instances. As you will be aware, a key concept in FHIR is the ability to describe a clinical scenario by choosing a number of resource instances and then connecting them up in references, kind of like Lego. So what we have here is we have as the central resource is our condition, our hypertension resource instance, and we see the references both to and from this instance. For example, we see that the subject of the condition is a reference to the patient. Then we see references from other resources. So for example, we see that we have an encounter resource here which references our condition, and here is another encounter which does the same. So as you can see, a single resource may be referenced by many others. And then finally here we have a list resource, and the list resource has a reference to the condition. What we can do is we can click on one of these other instances like so and change resource. What that does is that puts that resource into the center, as it were, and so we now see that this is a list resource, and the list resource has references to conditions as well as to the patient. So this is in fact the problem list in this particular case. So you can look at any of the resources which exist in exactly the same way. The encounter here, we look at the details here, we see the references, we can look at it either as text or the tree view or the JSON. If we were looking at a resource instance that had versions, then we would see the versions in this bar here, and we can click on those. So that's looking at individual resources. We had a quick look at the main resource references graph earlier on. Let's take another look at that right now. As you can see, it's a bit of a dog's breakfast. What we can do is we can, using this filter over here, change the resources that we see. So for example, if I take out the medication statement, the observation, the practitioner, encounter, appointment, and allergen tolerance, I now have a slightly smaller list. This is actually a slightly smaller set, I should say, of resources. We can see we have the patient here. There's our problem list. Notice, by the way, as we select resources, we see the details over here again as the tree or in the JSON view. And again, this is just another way of looking at the data which exists on file. And that's really the most important parts about the patient viewer. Just finally, our reminder that if you want to look at another server, we can go back to the launcher. We can edit this server list. We can change the name of the servers. I'm going to select NZ Project and save that. Now if I go into the patient viewer, by the way, if you just mouse over the patient viewer, you'll see the data server. Select patient. This time I'll search for somebody with a name called Hay. I'll choose Levi, and we can see a very similar, in fact, to be completely honest, it's exactly the same set of resources because I created it in the same way. Now let's take a look at the Server Query app. It can be launched from the launcher via its link down here, and if we click on that, we will see the app appear. The Server Query, although it defaults to the data server which is displayed on the launcher page, does allow you to select any server that you wish from within the app, and also, if you need to specify some other server. We will stay with the public FHIR server. If you did select an ad hoc server, you do have the option of providing an access token if the server that you are trying to access requires one. So this would be an OAuth access token. Gaining one of those is outside of the scope of this presentation, but I just draw your attention to it. And notice over here on the right hand side we see the actual URL to the base of the server. So this is the URL that RESTful queries should be made against. There are two main tabs. The first is the Server Capabilities tab, the second is the Query tab. The Server Capabilities tab uses the capability statement resource, which is exposed by all FHIR servers, in order to display what the capabilities of the server are. So if we look first at the RESTful interface, these are the resource types that the server understands. We can select a type. For example, let us select the patient, and we will then see further details about the support for this resource type on the server. This first tree view simply gives a tree type perspective of the resource itself. It's the one from the specification, not specifically for this server. Interactions indicates the interactions which this server can support for this type: create, delete, update, so forth. And here are the search parameters. Recall that the specification defines a number of search parameters, one or none or many of which a server can support. So a server doesn't have to support all of the search parameters. This is the list that this one does. Operations for this type are shown here, conditional updates, and if you wish, this is the actual JSON view from the capability statement. Clicking on this icon would take us to the specification for this type. So that's a handy way if you want to find out more about this particular resource type. The description tab shows a description of the server, again from the header information in the capability statement resource. Here are RESTful operations supported by the server, and finally the full JSON of the capability statement. So this is useful for determining what a server can actually do. This tab is a bit more useful, and it allows you to create queries against the RESTful interface. We'll test this out by using the patient resource, like so. Notice when we do that, a couple of things happen. First off, over here, a box appears with a button in it called execute, and it shows the REST query which is going to be executed against the server over here. Now this query, if I were to execute it, would return all of the patient resources off the public FHIR server, which is quite a few. In actual fact, it will probably be, in fact it will certainly be in parts, but we actually return them all. Here are the search parameters supported by the server that we saw before, and here is where we can start to add query parameters. For example, I could say give me all of the patient resources whose I need to click that, sorry, I should have done that, and then hey, show me all of the patient resources where the family name is Hay. If if I click on that and click on the execute button, I'll execute the query and we'll see that we have 17 resources where the patient name is Hay, and I can then view those resources in a manner similar to the one that we saw in the patient viewer, in that if I click on the resource I will see the JSON view, an XML view and a tree view. The graph is really mostly useful when you are retrieving multiple resource types from the server, which I'm not going to go into here. If we look at it, we'll simply see all of the patient resources and they are not interconnected at all. If we want to see the full bundle, we can do so here, and that will show the complete bundle. If I want to modify my query, I click on the new query button here and I go back to my list, and maybe I want to say that the given name here is Gail, like so. We see that my query has changed. I've added Gail to it. If I execute that, I now get a much smaller set of resources back. In this case, of course, I actually only get one, and I can select on that and view the details. I don't have to use the query builder if I don't wish to. For example, I'll go back for a new query. On this occasion I will go to the ad hoc REST query, and this allows me to enter any query that I wish to, and it will be executed against the target server, in this case FHIR. This is the equivalent of using a standard RESTful interface application such as Postman. For example, patient name equals Hay and gender equals male. In this case I get a list of 12 male patients whose name is Hay. And that's really the basics of the server query. The last clinFHIR module we'll take a look at is the GraphBuilder module. Like the others, it is launched from the clinFHIR launcher by clicking on the link like so. When the module loads, it displays any projects that you have already created, where a project is the container for the graph or graphs that you create. We'll go ahead and create a new project, and the scenario that we will use is creating a problem list. So to do that, we click on the new project, we enter a name, we can indicate whether or not this project has got multiple views. We'll leave that empty at the moment. We can also indicate if a passphrase is needed for uploading to the library. Again, we'll leave that. But what we will do is we will say that our project has got a server associated with it. Now, unlike the other modules, the GraphBuilder does not need to access a FHIR server in order to operate. It has built into it the information that it needs from a conformance server, so it can indeed run without any server. However, if you do indicate a server, you can then use that to save resources to. So we will indicate that we are going to save our resources to the clinFHIR R4 application. We have other options that we can do, but again we'll leave those for now, so we'll just save that. So we now have the problem list application. Now you can edit your program if you need to. I realize I haven't put a description in by clicking on the edit link here, and I'll give it a description. Create a problem list, and we'll see that it's the follows the base FHIR R4. So I'll click on that to select it, and this now brings us into the main work area for the GraphBuilder. It's divided into three main panes and a navigation bar across the top. In the nav bar are the links to upload to the library and to create a new project if we wish. We also have this option called toggle help, which will show help for the various parts of the application. We'll leave that off for the moment. The question mark links to further help. Then there are three main panes in the main workspace. This left hand pane here has got options that relate to the project as a whole, and then below it are the views in a project. It's possible for a project to have multiple views, although we won't be using that in this section. In the middle of the pane is in the middle of the screen is the main work area, and it has again a number of views and tabs: a graph view, references, content, and so forth, and we'll see those as we go through. And then to the right hand side here is where we can add new resource instances to our graph and to view existing resources. Let's start by creating a new resource instance, and we'll create a patient. As you can see, we have a list of all the resource types. We select it, we give it a name. Let's call it Gentleman Joe, and then we can enter the resource text if we wish to, but we'll leave that blank. So now we've added a resource instance, and remember the distinction that we made earlier on between the type or the template and the instance. So we now have an instance of a patient. This is going to be a problem list, so let's add a condition resource. We'll go back to our button, click on that, and add a condition resource, and we'll call it asthma. Oops. Like so. Notice how the tool has automatically linked up the condition resource of asthma to the patient, and this is the reason why we add the patient first. What happens is when you add a new resource type, the app looks to see if it has a reference to patient, and if it does, is there a patient in the graph, and if there is, then it will wind them up. We'll add another condition, which we'll call diabetes. So the same thing happens here, is that our diabetes condition has been linked up to our patient there. Now we want to show a problem list, so we're going to need a list resource. Now I should point out that this is optional in FHIR. You absolutely do not have to have a list, but it's convenient to do so. Again, we add a new resource. This time it's a list. It's going to be a problem list. That, and again the list is added to the or is connected to the patient. But now what we want to do is we want to create a link from the list resource to the condition resources, and to do that we first select the resource in our graph, and then over to the right hand side here we will see at the top here details about this particular resource, the details in the view, the definition, what can be in there, what's currently in there. We'll come back to this in just a second when we talk about FSH. But for now we want to add a reference, and the tool regards references as being in two sorts. The first sort of reference is a reference which goes directly, it's an element reference on the resource. So for example, the list resource has got an element called source, which is the source of the information. And what happens is the tool will look at each of these references and determine if there is a potential target in the graph, and in this case there is. And what this means is that we can now say that the source of information about this list comes from the patient, and as you can see, mousing over the path gives us that description which comes from the specification. And to add that reference, all we need to do is click on the add reference link, and it becomes the reference is then added. So what this is saying is that the problem list not only is about the patient, but it was created by the patient. But we now want to add our references to our condition resources. If we go and take a look at the resource definition, and this is what this tree is showing, we can look at it in the specification if we want to by clicking there. But notice how the entry element is a special type of element. In fact, it's called a backbone element, and a backbone element is an element type which can have child elements, and we can see that the entry has got a flag and it's got a deleted. It's also got this thing called item, which is the actual reference that we want to create. So when we create a reference from the list to the resource, it needs to be this special backbone type, and that's what this tab over here shows us. We can see that there is one backbone element in the list. If we click on that, we can see that there is actually one backbone element, and it's the entry list there. So in order to add this, we click on the add button, and this brings up a dialog which allows us to enter all of the other elements inside of that backbone element. So for example, we are able to say, let's create the reference. So the reference is to asthma. The tool is smart enough to be able to look at the type of reference and to only show those resources which are of that type. In this particular case, the reference can be to any type of resource. So all of the resources in the graph are shown, but we will select asthma. We could, if we wanted to, now add other elements that are flagged, deleted, and so forth, but we won't. We'll just stick at reference, and I draw your attention to this here. So this is FHIR shorthand, and we'll come back to this one in just a second. But I'm now going to insert that, and we see that we now have a list which has been created from problem list to asthma. We'll do another one to add it to diabetes, to reference, there it is, to diabetes, and insert. And so now we've created our graph, and you can see now the value in this sort of application in terms of visualizing these references. So in order to show a problem list, we've needed to use 3 different types of resource, and we've needed to connect them in a certain way. And the tool understands all of the possible references which any resource can make. So now that we've created or added our resources and created the links between them, let's go ahead and start adding some information into the resource instances. And we do this using a tool called FSH, or FHIR shorthand. This is a standard developed alongside FHIR, primarily intended to help with profiling of FHIR, but which also has the capability of describing content. And the GraphBuilder uses FHIR shorthand because the description is a lot easier to understand than, say, raw JSON or XML. At least I believe it is for the non-technical user. To add FSH to our resources, we can type it directly into the box here if we know what it is, but more likely we'll use the FSH editor, which we can load from this link here. The editor is a dialog. It shows all the elements in the resource down this left hand side here with the possible data types against each element. In some cases there can be more than one data type for elements which are choice elements. Let's go ahead and add the patient's name. We click on the data type. These are the components of the data type, and we'll say that the person's first name is Gentleman and their family name is Joe, and the use is usual. Note how the tool is able to look up the possible values for this element because it's coded and it's bound to a terminology. Terminology binding is a large topic in FHIR and not one that we will go into at the moment, but it is the way by which you can indicate that certain elements should be populated with values from a given terminology. And there is the FHIR shorthand for our patient name. And as you can see, it's quite understandable. The given name is gentleman, the family name is Joe, the name used is usual. We can go ahead and add other elements as we wish. So the code is male. Again, the tool was able to look up the possible values based on the what's called the binding in the specification, and then we can add that. Notice that the tool will add the FSH at the position of the cursor. So if I was to move the cursor to here and then go in and want to add in, say, a birth date and edit the enter the value for the birth date, 2010 minus 01 is 01, like so, then it will be added at that particular point. And I can move things around if I want to. If I don't like it there, I can select it, Control X, move it down, give it a bit of space, and add it there. And I'll just tidy that up like so. Now I have my FSH, but what I really want is JSON, because although I can use FSH to define the contents of the resource, it is not a valid representation for sharing resources. That must be in XML or JSON. So to convert it to JSON, we use an API provided by the MITRE team who helped create and define FHIR shorthand, and this little icon right here will invoke that, invoke the API, and it will create the JSON. If there are errors, for example, suppose I say something like families and try, we will get an element back. We will get an error back. Generally the error is reasonably descriptive. As you can see, we have a line number and a name. We see the problem straight away. I can correct that. I can re-invoke the API, and now I'm done. And so that's how you create content inside of a resource. I'll click Save. Now we will add just a couple more content before we continue. We will go to the condition and we will edit that. This is asthma, so I will go to the code and I will type in asthma. And again, now I am using a terminology operation here to expand the code there. I see that as being asthma, which I will now save. I'll go to diabetes and I will do exactly the same. So what I want to do, now I've created my resources, I want to save them to a server. At the moment, these resources are saved locally inside the computer browser using the browser storage. So if we were to close this application down and reopen it, it will still be there, and we can show that. I'll restart the application. There's our problem list, and here is the content that we have created. To save it to the server, I click on this Save Server link. Now this will only show if you have set a server in your project. If it's not there, then you will need, if the link is not present, then it almost certainly means that you've neglected to do that, and you can simply update it by clicking on the selector again and editing the project. As you can see, I've set the editor myself. I can use one of the preset ones, or I can enter a custom some other URL if I wish to, but I will stick with that one there. And I'll go back in and edit it. So now I can click on Save to Server. After clicking the Save to Server link, we get a list of all the resources in the graph that we are going to save to the server. The actual save process is in two parts. The first part, or prepare to save, validates that the resources themselves are correct, and the second part was the actual save itself. So let's click on prepare to save. This actually occurs itself in two parts. The first part is validating with FSH and sushi, and then the second part is using the $validate operation against the server itself. So as you can see, we do have a number of issues, but they are ones that we can ignore. And in general terms, if the Send to Server button appears, you can generally save it. This is saying that there ought to be a text element when there isn't. This one is an unknown code. In other words, the server that we are saving it to can't check that this is a valid SNOMED code. Again, these are not catastrophic errors for our purposes. So we'll now click on Send to Server, and we see the server has been updated. So the data has now been saved to the server, and you can see that it returns the actual IDs of the resources that it has created. And notice also that these have a history in them. So if you change the contents of a resource and then save it again, this will become a second version. Let's go and take a look at what these resources look like in the patient viewer. So let's go back to clinFHIR and go to the now remember that patient viewer is looking at these servers here, so we need to set the data server. So I'll edit that and change the data server to the New Zealand project, which is where this has been saved, and I'll save that. And then I will invoke the patient viewer, select patient. The patient's name was Gentleman Joe or Joe. There he is, Gentleman Joe. And there are the resources that we have created. 2 conditions, a list and a patient. And we can see the resource graph pretty much the same as we've just created it. So that's all we have to talk about with regards to the GraphBuilder. As you can see, it is a way to create example resources and then save them to a FHIR server, after which any application that can access a FHIR server can read them. And this concludes this presentation on some of the clinFHIR modules. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, do feel free to contact me via the Zulip chat channel.